welcome to Trackside Video's 30 Years of Change. Virtually all of today's railway enthusiasts began their interest as train spotters, a hobby incidentally the greatness of which far outweighs superficial appearances. In the 1960s, there was possibly no better place for watching trains than Crewe, but the lads in short trousers on those smoke and grime-filled platforms could never have envisaged the sweeping changes that were about to transform Britain's railways. And from the last dying ashes and embers, emptied out from those final emotional steam workings, would emerge a modern high-speed railway, bringing unprecedented levels of safety, comfort and speed all over the network. The modernisation of Britain's railways, however, carried a price, and in the 1960s, the policy of closure associated with Dr. Beeching was pursued with vigour by his first successors. Nottingham Victoria on the Great Central closed in 1969. And Leicester Belgrave Road on the Great Northern was already in ruins when these scenes were filmed in 1966. The last Great Central mainline services ran the same year and were worked mainly by Black Fives. And down on the southern at Vauxhall, a Greenie MU heads south, while West Country Loco number 34021 powers towards London. Regular steam-hauled expresses on the Southern continued until July 1967. A merchant navy thunders past Mitchell Diva. And back at London, a standard Class 4 tank attracts a great deal of attention at Victoria after bringing in empty coaching stock for a rail tour. O2s were still at work on the Isle of Wight in 1966, as noted in our next scene, as an example makes for ride, probably on a train strengthening service. The replacement for steam, however, didn't always live up to everyone's expectations, and the Isle of Wight became a kind of living museum when elderly London Transport tube stock arrived to take over services on the island in 1967. Steam continued in the northeast on collieries diagrams. A J27 is seen south of Sunderland. And north of the border, a standard Class 5 brings an Aberdeen to Glasgow service into Cumbernauld. British Rail's last steam workings operated in the northwest in August 1968. An 8F takes empty coal wagons near Rose Grove. The end of steam had been foreshadowed 13 years earlier in the 1955 modernisation plan, which stated that the steam locomotive has in the past served the railways well. It has the virtues of low first cost, simplicity, robustness and long life. However, the report then went on to say that Many factors combine to indicate that the end of the steam locomotive is at hand. No early demise was at first envisaged, but at a press conference in 1963, Dr. Beeching had quoted Macbeth, "If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere best it were done quickly." And 5 years later it was all over, and the standard gauge steam railway in Britain was left largely to the preservationists. Many enthusiasts travelled abroad, where steam could still be witnessed, such as these Bayer Peacock tanks at work on the South Maitland Railway in Australia. Or here in Holland, where a visiting Belgian 442 Atlantic returns a passenger excursion to Brussels. And for the less adventurous, there were always the industrial concerns. This fireless locomotive, built by Hunsloop Barclay of Kilmarnock in 1928, is seen at work at Shell UK, Ardrossan. But it wasn't all bad news. 44027 heads from the Leicester Museum of Technology to Butterley and active preservation. During the 1950s and 1960s, several prototype diesel locomotives had appeared on Britain's railways. The English Electric DP2 had been recording splendid performances on both East and West Coast main lines before coming to a sad end at Thirsk in September 1967, when it collided with the derailed wagons of a cement train and was later removed to York Depot and withdrawn. Hawker Siddeley's offering, Kestrel, was the last of the early prototypes to appear, being introduced on loan in 1968. Withdrawn in January 1971, the loco was finally exported to the Soviet Union. In the mid-1960s, steam and diesel traction could of course be seen side by side. These scenes at Leicester Depot in 1966 include a Class 27 locomotive moving onto the shed, before the whole class was transferred to Scotland. Further north on the West Coast main line at Low Gill, a 264 tank runs down light engine. And Black 5, number 45349, double-heads Metropolitan Vickers Cobo, number D5701 on a northbound freight. These Metrovicks hardly outlived steam, the last fleet member being withdrawn from Carlisle in 1969. An interesting experiment which failed to save closure of many rural branch lines in the 1960s was the use of a number of rail buses. Here an example enters Carstairs. Further north at Cumbernauld, an Austerity powering a freight is passed by a green North British Type 2 Class 29. Unfortunately, no mainline locomotive built by the North British Locomotive Company survives into preservation. The last of these Scottish allocated examples were withdrawn in December 1971. Full yellow ends are now in evidence at Fort William. Their Western region counterpart Class 22s fared little better, the final examples being withdrawn in January 1972. 6315 approaches Lostwithiel. The 060 Class 14 diesel hydraulic shunters were one of the least filmed diesel classes on BR. With the disappearance of the local freight work for which they were introduced, the class was obsolete before it was delivered, and all 56 were withdrawn within 5 years of the first locomotive appearing. Other early diesel designs were of course more successful. A green 31 brings Pullman stock into King's Cross. And Nimbus, already in blue, heads for Scotland. The Class 25s nearly made it into the 1990s. A green example trundles a fate through the gloomy cavern of Nottingham Victoria in 1966. The last Class 24 was withdrawn from crew in 1980. Here a fleet member passes by near Rugby Central. The most famous diesel-hauled passenger service on the Great Central was the service between York and Bournemouth, seen here northbound passing Bulwell Common, north of Nottingham Victoria, with a brand new two-tone green Class 47 at the head. BR's corporate identity programme, with the famous double arrow logo, had been launched in 1965, and now the new colours were to be monastral or rail blue. The idea of blue in general wasn't totally new. AC Electrics had been introduced in a kind of electric blue as early as 1959. The first diesel locomotive class to be painted in rail blue from new was the Class 50s. These had been introduced as a stopgap locomotive for the Crewe to Glasgow services until such time as electrification on the route could be completed, and soon they became a common sight, working in pairs north of Crewe, on expresses such as the famous Royal Scot. Meanwhile on the west, things had always been a bit different. The Westerns were first introduced in 1961, but the smaller warship class had first appeared 3 years earlier. The 836 Powerful roars through Lostwithiel. And warships abound at Plymouth North Road. The 804 Avenger and the 868 Zephyr move into the station, while the 825 Intrepid waits at the platform. The Hymex soldiered on until 1975. A rail blue example is noted here at Swindon Works. The Western region also boasted the longest lived of the Type 4 prototypes. Entering traffic in 1961 as D0 to 80, Falcon was eventually taken into BR stock as D1200, the only member of Class 53. The loco is seen here at Ebbw Junction. And we end our interlude on the west with D1048 Western Lady, now happily preserved, rolling into Paddington to take out a West of England express. The Total Operations Processing System, or TOPS, was completed nationwide during the mid-1970s, and existing BR locomotives received new TOPS numbers between 1971 and 1975, even if in some cases they were still carrying green livery. In most cases, of course, the locomotives had already received repaints into rail blue. 40042 departs Carlisle. This was in retrospect a happy period for Britain's railway enthusiasts. 37168 heads north out of Sheffield Midland. And further east, Class 0303149 is busy about Lincoln Central Station. The original peak Class 44s lasted until 1980, and in later life were seen chiefly on East Midlands freights. Great Gable is noted here passing Mount Sorrel near Syston Junction. And just west of Leicester, a Class 25 takes a brick train from the London Brick Company to Liverpool through Hinckley. One of the most expensive classes of the initial dieselisation plan was the Type 5 Deltic. Deliveries started in 1961, and after a few initial teething troubles, the class was put to work with a vengeance. The 22 Deltics replaced 55 steam locomotives on East Coast Main Line expresses, and performance exceeded anything that had up until then been seen in Britain. Over on the West Coast Main Line, first generation AC electrics could still be seen. Here we observe a rear shot of 83003, withdrawn as early as May 1975, departing Glasgow Central. The Class 33s have traditionally been associated with the southern region, and at one time a subclass was regularly employed on Weymouth Quay trains. The 1970s also saw sister Class 27 locomotives operating in push-pull formation between Glasgow Queen Street and Edinburgh. Here, a set passes Falkirk. In the early 1970s, diesel electrics became increasingly common on the west. A Rail Blue 47 departs Paddington. Regular visits of Class 31s to Paddington didn't commence until the withdrawal of the Hymex. Here, two examples arrive at the terminus, probably with a service from Birmingham. By 1970, the project to complete the West Coast Main Line electrification north of Crewe had begun, and through Anglo-Scottish services began in May 1974. allowed the Class 50s to be transferred onto the Western region to replace the non-standard hydraulics and express passenger workings. 50019, named Ramillies and still in rail blue livery, is the loco in charge. With the transfer of the Class 50s, 35 new locomotives were ordered for the Glasgow electrification scheme and designated Class 87. 87004 Britannia departs Birmingham New Street for Euston. The Woodhead route across the Pennines was the place to see Class 76 DC electrics. Here, Yorkshire Coal heads for Lancashire, behind 76021 and 76008. It seemed inconceivable that the Woodhead route would be declared surplus to requirement in 1981, since the line had been modernised at great expense only 25 years or so earlier. But it was, and the Class 76 has bowed out on enthusiast specials, as noted here, leaving Dinting for Sheffield. The winds of change were now really blowing, and the late 1970s saw the total withdrawal of one of the most famous modern traction classes, the Westerns. And very significantly, the last runs and farewell tours saw emotions which hadn't been witnessed since the end of steam. This new interest in modern traction was also apparent in the preservation movement, which previously had shown scant interest in diesels, but now had to take into account a whole new generation of railway enthusiasts who have no remembrance of steam. The Clayton Class 17s were amongst BR's least successful designs, one member running for less than 4 years before being sold for scrap. And if the 8568 hadn't been sold into industry in 1971, it's almost certain that no examples would have survived into preservation. But here the loco is seen at its new home on the North Yorkshire moors, still painted in the white colours of its latest owner, the Ribblehead Cement Company. And over at Willesden, Class 02 number D2860 is towed to the National Railway Museum at York, along with Q7 steam locomotive number 63460, by two Class 33 Crompton locomotives, numbers 33064 and 33210, working top and tail. The 7 Woodhead DC electric Class 77 locomotives had been withdrawn in 1968 and exported to Holland the following year. Now, mounting interest saw many British enthusiasts making the trip to see these locomotives work once again. And what's more, in the case of Electra, the locomotive was eventually restored to green livery once more. Here, the loco passes by on the outskirts of Rotterdam. Back at home, a new freight era, the era of the Type 5, was beginning. The 135-strong Class 56 fleet was introduced between 1977 and 1984, mainly for MGR duties, and succeeded in significantly reducing the loads carried on a single train, compared with their Class 47 predecessors. Major changes were also afoot on the passenger front. Up until now, nearly all loco-hauled passenger workings had involved the costly and time-consuming process of locos running round at terminus stations. However, this wasn't to be with the new HSTs, the prototype of which was unveiled in 1972 and carried its first passengers, albeit non-fare paying, in August 1973. The production sets entered service in the mid-1970s. Without an overhead wire in sight, an example enters Stoke Tunnel on the East Coast Main Line near Grantham. In May 1980, an exhibition was held at Rain Hill to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and included both vintage and modern forms of transport. The success of the HST was briefly overshadowed by the fiasco of the new APT designed for the West Coast Main Line. Originally intended for a maximum speed of 155 miles per hour, public operation began in 1981, but reliable service running couldn't be maintained, and the train was subsequently withdrawn. Here, a set powers through Nuneaton on a London to Glasgow service. The 1980s would possibly be best remembered for a relaxation of BR's formerly rigid adherence to the corporate image and no-naming policy of the mid-1970s. In 1984, 50007 was painted into Great Western Region green and named Sir Edward Elgar. Here the loco departs Penzance. Similarly, in 1983, Class 40 number 4122 was repainted green by staff at Towton and would eventually take her place in the National Railway Museum at York. In this condition, she departs Appleby on the Settle and Carlisle. Colour light signalling on Britain's railways definitely represented a major technical advance, but lacked the appeal of boxes and semaphores. Sleaford remarkably retains 4 boxes, north, south, east and west, up until the present day. Peak number 45064 passes Sleaford West with a Skegness to Leicester service. The Leicester Gap remained famous for its boxes and semaphores throughout the 1980s. A Class 25 brings a cement train from Ketton to Castle Bromwich, under the gantry and through the station. Further south, one of the then new HST sets passes Wigston South and heads for London St Pancras. HSTs took over through Leicester, Nottingham and Sheffield haulage on the Midland Main Line in 1983, but before this, Peaks had ruled the route for 20 years. A double-headed working was a regular performer on the Sundays only 12:15 Derby to St Pancras, almost up until the end. in the early 1980s, 20 Class 86s were transformed into a new subclass and renumbered into an 86-3 sequence. Here, 86328 drags a Class 25 and its tanks train out of Nuneaton. In 1983 also saw the introduction of the new Type 5 Class 58 freight locomotives, which carried the new rail freight livery from new. 58049 leaves Willington for Denby. The large logo colour scheme had been first regularly carried from August 1980 by Class 50s returning from refurbishment at Doncaster Works. 50015 Valiant departs Birmingham New Street. The 1980s also saw the introduction of a 15-minute Gatwick Express service, which in 1985 carried almost 2.5 million passengers. Class 73s were put in charge of the trains, and in 1988 a number of members were renumbered into a 73-2 series, especially for these duties. 73208, wearing the original Intercity livery, departs London Victoria. But withdrawals continued apace, and indeed, with so many locomotives arriving at Vic Berries of Leicester for cutting during the summer of 1987, the company was forced to build its famous stack of Class 25s and Class 27s in order to save space. To assist in moving stock around within the yard once it had arrived from BR, Berries ran a former 03 shunter, number 03069. Happily, where there was decay there was also growth, and public demand by local inhabitants saw the construction of a new station at South Wigston, serving Leicester and Coventry, situated just east of the site of the old Wigston Glenparva station. Changes had also been taking place at Liverpool Street. Monday the 13th of May 1985 saw the beginning of electric working to Ipswich, with 8 Class 86-2s based at Ilford for the service. Later, electrification reached Norwich, with the locos based at Crown Point. 86235 Harold Macmillan departs Liverpool Street. The Yeoman Class 59s were the first privately owned diesels to work on VR. The first 4 were introduced in 1986, with a 5th added in 1989. 59004 Yeoman Challenger powers out of Acton Yard and past Hanwell. Meanwhile, north of the border, the push-pull 27s on the Glasgow-Edinburgh services weren't taking kindly to a 650 miles per day roster, and they were replaced by 12 Class 47s modified for push-pull working. 47707 passes Cogar with a Glasgow to Edinburgh service. The Class 90s were first built in 1987 and had originally been designated Class 87 too. Here, 90002 enters crew. The days of the Class 20s were fast running out when a few examples were taken over by Hunslet Barclay to provide weed-killing facilities for BR. In their distinctive new house colours, 2902 and 2903 spray past Trent Junction. The Class 91s were introduced in 1988 and were first used with a modified fleet of HST power cars as surrogate DVTs. Officially, these HSTs provided no power, but on occasions they seem to have been used, and with the combination of HST and 91, a remarkable total of 8,350 horsepower was available. The complete Class 91 locomotive has a streamlined cab at one end and a blunt-ended cab at the other. Running blunt-end first isn't common, but the end is provided with a pleasantly styled cab front. Here an example storms by on test with sleeper cars. The 1990s began, much as the 1980s had ended. Interregional passenger services were still in the hands of the ever-present HST sets, as noted here on the Lickey Incline south of Birmingham. In spite of the power of the new rail freight Type 5 Class 58 locomotives, on some occasions, loads necessitated their having to run in pairs, as noted here, heading south out of Toton Yard for Didcot. However, the 1990s would see a new arrival which was to penetrate into virtually all areas of the railway network. Built by Brush Traction, the new Class 60 locomotives continued the trend of ever more powerful Type 5 freight locos. 60010, carrying rail freight construction colours, is seen here coming off the Pinxton branch at Pyebridge Junction on what was probably the first Class 60 hauled train on the branch. Such was the success of the Yeoman 59s that the Amy Roadstone Company ordered 4 more. Also built by General Motors, these locomotives arrived at Newport Docks on the 19th of October 1990 and wore their own distinctive yellow and grey ARC livery. 59101 Village of Whatley is seen heading onto the North London line at Stratford. However, at around the same time, many of the most traditional of British Rail's classes were running on borrowed time. The Class 20s were taken off their MGR diagrams in the early 1990s. Just before the end, 2 examples in contrasting liveries bring a service from Denbigh Colliery past Stenson Junction and into Willington Power Station. The Class 26s had been first introduced in 1958. Well over 30 years later, 26040 powers a passenger special past Leyland near Preston as part of the North West Loco Hold Weekend on the 25th of April 1992. The Class 50s would last until 1994 and attract a cult following comparable to that of the Deltics 15 years earlier. Carlisle 50 Farewell Rail Tour on Saturday, April the 11th, 1992 took 2 of the class from Waterloo onto their old stamping ground, the West Coast Main Line, and over Shap to Carlisle. Here they arrive at Crewe on the return journey back to London. The 47s, meanwhile, continue to give sterling service after more than 30 years on Britain's railways. A Rail Express Systems example takes a Pullman service past Milnice on September the 24th, 1994. In the early 1990s, 47s were extensively used on the Waterloo-Exeter services, as Class 50s were progressively withdrawn. 47576, wearing the Network South East colours, storms through Surbiton and heads west. Occasionally, Crompton Class 33s were also pressed into service. Departmental grey liveried 33109 departs Waterloo for Exeter on Thursday the 16th of January 1992. The Class 37s, first introduced in 1965, seem set to last well into the 21st century. The class has now long been associated with Cornish China clay workings. 37673 leaves Lostwithiel on the freight-only line to Foyie on the 30th of June 1994. And in our next view, 3 Class 37-9s, numbers 2, 5 and 4, take empty steel flats, probably from Clanwern to Margam, on the 6th of May 1994. A small number of Class 08 shunters were converted into Class 09s at RFS Kilnhurst, and usually a Class 37 was used to transport the completed locomotives to Toton Depot for overnight stabling before dispatch to their new home depots. Here, an ensemble passes Codner Park Junction south of Alfreton. .37s are also common on Scottish summer passenger services. 37175 departs Edinburgh Waverley for Inverness on July the 2nd, 1994. The Class 31s also soldier on. 31119 and 31106 come off the Bentink Colliery branch to give up the token at Pinxton after delivering ballast and rails for track relaying at the colliery. The Class 91s reached Scotland in 1991 and now hold the record time of 3 hours and 29 minutes for a journey between London and Edinburgh. Here one of the fleet passes the Northumberland coast north of Berwick. Three Class 90 locomotives were repainted into European liveries in 1992. 9129, wearing German Neuraut livery, is seen here with a northbound freightliner at Slindon south of Crewe. On March the 26th, 1994, a rail tour ran from Paddington to the Cotswolds and back. Labelled the end of Intercity, this marked the end of Intercity as a corporate company, although the term is still of course used as a marketing name. Complete with Intercity headboard, 47834 arrives back at Paddington to a full floral and musical reception. Meanwhile, railway preservation in Britain continues to thrive, with now both steam and diesel locomotives providing the attraction. Standard Class 4 tank number 80080 takes a Santa Special service out of Butterley in December 1993. And D9531 is seen at work on the East Lancs route, entering Brooks Bottom Tunnel. The 1990s have brought with them the decision to privatise Britain's railways, and as a run-up to privatisation, some locomotives have begun to appear with new logos on the body side. 56099, wearing Transrail branding, passes Norton Bridge. Record producer Pete Waterman has also seen the potential for private owners to run trains on VR. 44710 Lady Godiva, in Waterman Railway's black livery, brings a parcel train towards Crewe. This livery, based on the old London and North Western joint colours, has also been applied to preserved locomotives. D8188 works behind green liveried 8031 on the 1994 East Lancs diesel Gala. Peak class number D172 is also owned by Waterman Railways and was the first preserved diesel locomotive to work a rail tour on VR. Restored to original green, yet still carrying Ixion nameplates, the locomotive worked from Derby to St Pancras on October the 1st, 1994, and from St Pancras to Sheffield and back the next day, where the train is seen passing Spondon on the return journey. The Channel Tunnel has opened up whole new opportunities for Britain's railways, as a gateway to Europe for both freight and passenger workings. The services are to be worked by new Eurostar trains. One example is seen here arriving via the M25. So perhaps now the wheel has come full circle, and sweeping changes seem to be about to transform Britain's railways once more, as they did 30 years ago. The West Coast Main Line would of course be a prime target for privatisation, a Class 86 powers by for the north. So as the sun sets on Britain's railways as we know them, let's conclude by hoping that the next 30 years will prove to be as fascinating as the last for the next generation of Britain's railway enthusiasts, although possibly not always for the same reasons. enjoyed this Trackside Videos programme, you'll also enjoy our other releases. The Rail Blue colours held sway for almost 20 years, and in this programme we celebrate the Rail Blue era, with 25 different diesel and electric loco classes at locations all over the length and breadth of the United Kingdom. And since the footage spans 25 years, as well as many loco types now extinct on VR, we also feature a large number of current classes, seen here in their former blue colours. The Brush Class 47 was by far the largest single VR mainline locomotive class. In this 60-minute programme, we trace the story from 20 surplus Class 46 power units at Brush in 1962 to a locomotive fleet of 512, which has given over 30 years sterling service on VR. The class is seen from Scotland to Cornwall, and the programme features all the subclasses, all the celebrity repaints, and most of the regular and irregular duties. Focus on Towton features 16 different diesel and electric classes hard at work around the Towton area, from Trent Junction in the south to Claycross in the north and Nottingham in the east. Several historic scenes are also included, with both steam and diesel locomotives providing the power. In Focus on Birmingham, we travel to the West Midlands. A large variety of modern traction traverses the area, and we observe a comprehensive cross-section of these workings. Many interludes of historic interest are also featured, showing both steam and diesel locomotives hard at work. The late 1960s saw the end of standard gauge steam on VR, and in this all-new compilation we observe a host of steam locomotive types at locations all the way from Alloa to Shanklin. In addition, we feature steam's last outpost, the North West, including the final tours and the famous 15 guinea special. London has been Britain's largest city since Roman times. This programme, Volume 1 in a set of 2, covers the northern half of the capital, observing 15 different locomotive classes working all over the area. In addition, we feature the routes out of Euston, St Pancras, Marylebone, King's Cross, Liverpool Street and Fenchurch Street, as well as a feature on Stratford and the North London lines. Order your copies from the address on this video cover or your local rail video stockist.